So we're looking at Merrily on High, Merrily on High by Colin, Stephenson. And today we're going to look at chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is Cranleigh, I'm guessing that's how you say it, and 4 is Oxford. And so basically we're into school days now. I wasn't quite sure exactly what his age is when he's talking about Cranleigh, but I get the impression that's like middle school. But maybe it's all the way to high school. I don't even know if they have the same divisions, age-wise that we do. But in any case, the important thing is it's boarding school. And I don't remember when it was, but I remember as a child being first encountering this concept of boarding school. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine just being, your family just drops you off at school and leaves you. It's like camp for a year, only you have to go to school. But it is part of the culture, a lot more so over there. And I don't think it's just, a wealthy thing, because I think this is a public school, a state school. Now over there, there's a divergence in terminology, and what they call a public school is what we would call a private school. And I don't think they would call it a private school what we call a public school, but it's like I don't know what it is. Anyway, so I think this is a public school, boarding school, preparatory school. Yeah, preparatory, that'd be high school, I guess. And it's, this is where he goes. So,
I think he was about 9 when he got confirmed.
Well, that's right. That's what kind of confused me, because I thought boarding school, that would be
1920 or 1921?
Yeah, well, it says in 1928 I was sent to school. Is he born in 1920?
Probably. I don't
So,
know.
like 8 or 9 or so. So, this, a lot younger than I thought. Be weird for me. He describes the headmaster as more of a visual character than a character and behavior. The bewhiskered first headmaster, bottom of 37, who glared down upon us grimly, was named, rather inappropriately, Dr. Merriman. So this is not the current headmaster, but the one who, I guess, founded the place and was in a big portrait on the wall, looking down, the bewhiskered. And they talk about kind of a rite of passage. He describes it as being almost like a beautiful prison. It made me think of watching that movie, Shawshank Redemption. And it's about a prison, but it's back in the 30s or so. And, it was back when architecture was, even a prison was beautiful and had architectural features that just, spoke of stateliness. And
I don't remember that part.
it wasn't just like we have today where it's just a big cube. It almost looks like a concrete cardboard box. So he says, page 38, the original buildings, they belong to a period of high romance at the end of the last century, when it was thought suitable to put boys in a monastic setting and make them so uncomfortable that anything which happened to them later in life would seem comparatively nice. This has been the strength of the public school system, which has not yet been completely humanized. So I'm a little confused there when he says public school system. I think that's private schools, but I'm not sure. Or it might be like non-religious, or I don't know. It throws me. And I resonated with his description of loneliness when his parents dropped him off. Even today, I can recreate the horrible feeling of desolation as I saw my little island of security disappearing on 4 wheels and leaving me entirely unprotected. And I was very touched on 38 in the middle when he talked about the comfort of his rosary. He said he wasn't, he was still young and he wasn't really aware of what to do with it so much, but it was kind of a trinket or a talisman, and I don't like that term though, that was his sort of way of connecting with the comfort of the Holy Spirit. He said, at that moment I was fingering a rosary which I had been given at the monastery. Although I had not yet learned how to perform the devotion, the very feel of it brought me enormous comfort. At night, I would go to sleep clutching it in my hand, and it gave me a secret feeling of security. During the war, when I was in danger, I liked to feel my rosary in my pocket and suppose that it was a recreation of this earlier experience. And it made me think of two things. It made me think of Bishop Michael Marshall talking about his mother, and she was a regular devotee of the rosary, and even when she was in the hospital and seemed like was hardly conscious, she would still be holding that, and she would every now and then move from bead to bead. So she wasn't comatose, but she was just very, I don't know, out of it or something. And of course it makes me think of Rebecca. She would always have one wrapped around her hand. And this, in a certain sense, it's kind of superstitious, but I don't think it really goes too far down that road. It's just we need something kind of tangible. I think it's a very similar thing about the scapulars. It's something tangible. We are material, tangible creatures, and we need something to touch and hold on to and connect with in a visible, tangible way. And then he gets into the parts that are disturbing, frankly, that I don't like, and that were a bit shocking. And I was also surprised at myself that I had no recollection of this whatsoever, because I've read this book at least twice before, and I did not remember any of the disturbing material. So I'll read it for the audience out there. But basically, he talks about homosexual attraction among the boys. So it's we talked about being a prison. It is in more ways than one. So sometimes you may get attention that you don't want. So it begins on page 38. He says, "We were not, however, taught monastic custody of the eyes. The place looked like a monastery. And I could not think why an older boy in another house kept winking at me, for I had yet to learn about many aspects of school life." And then on the next page, various alterations were made in the chapel during my time at school, mainly as a result of installing a new organ in the ambulatory behind the altar. This involved the moving of the old instrument with its gurgling water pump and dark recesses, where many unsalutary friendships were consummated. For it did not take me long to discover what the winking had been about. Perhaps this was why at the same time as the old organ was removed, a rather frightening text reading, "Be sure your sin will find you out," also disappeared from above the door by which we left the chapel. And then he goes on, bottom of 39. "From the first moment I saw the demure line of surplice-clad trebles glide into the chapel, I determined to join them and succeeded in disguising my tone deafness when we were tested, so that I was soon imploring the deity for the wings of a dove in honeyed tones, which drew admiring glances from older boys who were starting on that romantic quest, which was likely to lead to an invitation behind the organ." And then finally on 46, talking about one of the older priests, I think it might have been a visiting priest. "He once preached to us about platonic friendship, in which he was much interested, from the text, 'See that you love one another.' This caused a great stir among the housemasters, who spent a lot of their time and energy in trying to ensure that we did no such thing. The fact that there were those on the staff who underlined the romantic nature of these attachments and encouraged them to come out into the open meant that Cranleigh was morally better than many other schools at that period, where such things were rigorously suppressed." So this whole thing just kind of like, I thought boarding school was bad in the first place.
You hear about it in the novels and in the BBC productions, and you think that has to be overblown. But when this guy is talking very, very plainly about it and having it be a common thing in all public schools, that's pretty weird.
Well, at least the only upside of this is that it's not something that seems to be a clergy problem. It's just the boys and each other, and just being around boys when their hormones start to gear up. But it is disturbing that it seems to be so commonplace, and we'll just laugh it off. I had the same experience about reacting to hazing. And I've never been hazed myself, but just hearing about these things, I'm like, good grief. I mean, you do things so outlandish that people may even die at times. It just, I guess I'm too sheltered. On page 40, he gets into some more churchy things. He talks about
New prayer book.
the new prayer book, the 1928. Now, this is not our 1928,
Yeah.
but it is their
Still a new
proposed book.
Yeah.
And its status was that it was approved by convocation by the church, but it failed to receive approval in Parliament. And so it is authorized for use, but it's not official. And I don't know if any place still does use it, officially in church. I would think that with all the more recent liturgies that it's just fallen by the wayside. If somebody wants to do something really old-fashioned, they just pull out the real prayer book. But it's better than they make it out in here. It was kind of a catch-22 because it improved a lot of things. Basically, every revision since you had the first prayer book in 1549, and that was the most Catholic one. And then the next one, 1552, was the most Protestant one. And every revision since then has been leading back in a Catholic direction. And this did too. But some of the things didn't satisfy some people. And so there was an effort to sabotage it, really from more the high church angle, which kind of is surprising because you would think it'd be more the low church angle. But the idea was, okay, we're going to give you high churchy people the things that you want for the most part, but then you have to use it. You can't diverge from it. You can't add anything to it. And that was really the thing that scuttled it in the end, because they were happy just fixing the broken prayer book rather than getting a new one. And so he says the first that he'd heard about the new prayer book was it was described to him as an extremely dishonest book put together by honest men. So we can't blame them, but it was terrible. And he says, I was already enough of a party man to express abhorrence of the new book. So he didn't really know anything about it except that it's just bad. Our people don't like it. What in fact happened was that an era of complete liturgical chaos was ushered in and is still with us, having extended to the Holy Roman Church, which today appears like a lady in very old-fashioned clothes who is trying to turn a somersault. To me, it almost seems the opposite, although it's come back a lot in recent years, where you have an amazing Gothic or Renaissance or Baroque cathedral, and then you have people wearing polyester rags in it as vestments, where it's like the rite doesn't fit the setting. Mm-hmm. It says, at Cranleigh we used the prayer book and sang matins and evensong every Sunday with a slightly shortened version on weekdays. And that's what they do at my daughter's school. They sing matins every morning, and they do a kind of a truncated, but still chanted evensong at the end of the school day. There was compulsory chapel. He says in those days at public schools, these days, boys at public schools are in a ferment about compulsory chapel and regarded as the grossest infringement of their liberties. I sometimes think that the answer would be to put the chapel out of bounds and punish boys severely for going there, and then they would feel deprived and want to go to church for the rest of their lives. And then he talks about preparing for confirmation. One of the mentor clergy, or maybe it's just one of the teachers, somebody on the staff, said that he ought to be, the headmaster, there it is. He said, the headmaster said, you ought to be confirmed as soon as possible, because he's showing interest in religious life and so on. I am now quite convinced that I ought to have been confirmed much earlier, as I developed great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament by the time I was 9 years old. But in those days, bishops made a great fuss about the age of those they confirmed and made very stringent regulations about it. Father Pat Shaw of York, when asked to supply the ages of his confirmation candidates, added their weight and height, implying that this information seemed to him as relevant to the administration of the sacrament as their age. It was he who, in showing Queen Mary the marvelous medieval glass in his church, said, as they passed in front of the tabernacle, "This is where we bob, ma'am." And she did. So I was intrigued by this whole thing about confirmation. I've never had a firm sort of position on what age somebody should be confirmed at. I figure it should be unique to the person. And then also there's this issue that's come up in more recent years of going back to the old pattern that you should be confirmed before First Communion. And some Roman Catholic dioceses have recently transitioned to that as their regular practice. I don't know about any Anglican dioceses.
Yeah, that was our thing when I was confirmed.
Well, see, back in the older prayer book, 28, you had, well, I think they had changed it. It used to be you had to be confirmed first, but then they reworded it so you had to be at least desirous of confirmation. And then they used that to kind of shoehorn in the Roman Catholic practice, which I think is really kind of a late 19th, early 20th century thing of doing First Communions at like 8, 9, 10 years old.
Would you be alarmed if the cradle Anglican was ex-teenager before they were confirmed? I mean, would you start saying, hey folks, your son we need to talk about this.
Yeah.
Well, there'd be a limit.
Yeah, I guess I would prefer it be more younger than older. There's just really no reason to put it off as long as you are engaged and willing to make your own vows for yourself. You know, that's really all you're waiting for. I was baptized at age 10. I'm still committed to that. You know, I was old enough to make that sort of affirmation. So I figure the age of accountability really opens up the door for that being old enough to be confirmed, which would be like 7, I guess. Maybe 6 at the youngest. Let's see. Oh, there's more disturbing stuff I skipped over. We'll just skip over it. He's talking about one of the, I think this is still the headmaster on page 42, about halfway down. I think he realized I was genuinely more interested in religion than most of my fellows, and he took a lot of trouble to bring me into a living relationship with God, and for this I can never be grateful enough. He attempted to moderate my devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and warned me against the doctrine of the Assumption, which he obviously did not understand. So I whipped out a little pamphlet and tried to put him right. But I discovered that he much preferred to think that Roman Catholics taught that Our Lady did not die but just shot up into the air, an opinion which the pious picture on the front of my tract certainly reinforced. And that really was a thing. Hearing people describe the sort of history of doctrinal development. So the Assumption was defined as a dogma by Pope Pius XII in 1950. And in the Eastern Church, they believe in the Assumption, but they don't sort of play up that end of it. They talk about the falling asleep of the Virgin Mary or her death. And then she's resurrected and either disappears or is assumed into heaven. And in the Western Church, there was a long sort of like, well, we're not going to exactly decide whether she died or not. Maybe she sort of bypassed death, kind of like Enoch and Elijah, or maybe she died and was resurrected and ascended, sort of like the Eastern Orthodox view of the thing. And it seemed like before the definition, there was a lot more weighted to the side of she didn't die. And then after the definition, it became almost a universal consensus, okay, she did die. And the definition doesn't say anything about it. It carefully avoids mentioning whether she died or not. But for whatever reason, there's this kind of shift in theology from one side to another. I think one of the visiting priests, Canon Hutchison, beloved Hutch, he'd been preaching at the school, this is page 43, and the headmaster said to him, "Would you be prepared to hear confessions?" And he added ominously, there are some boys who are going to be expelled. He says, I went secretly over to the chapel of the junior school, having worked my way through the self-examination questions in the Little St. Swithin prayer book. And I think I have one of those somewhere.
I used
And
to.
it's
Yeah.
real small and real thin, which at that time was my standard and authority of all that was correct. I seemed to have done everything and might well have been like the small boy who read right to the end and confessed that he had been published and printed by the Church Union. And I've had that experience hearing confessions where it's just like, okay, you can stop just reading everything right off the page and talk to me like a real person, you know. And then he talks about birth control on page 44. So he's going through his own first confession in preparation for confirmation. And he says, I read out my list of sins, and he, the priest, appeared to be quite unmoved, and indeed quite uninterested in those which had given me the deepest heart-searching as to whether I should possibly reveal them. He talked a bit about my prayers, and then gave me a long lecture on, of all things, to a schoolboy, the iniquity of birth control. I can honestly say that I had not the least idea what he was talking about. But he did not leave it there, for he sent me through the post some anti-birth control pamphlets, which I was showing around to the other boys, older and more knowing than I was, when a prefect saw and confiscated them. This led to an interview with my housemaster, who, realizing my ignorance, gave me a talk which made things rather clearer, but frightened me very much. Birth control was a mania with Father Eustace, who had worked in South Africa, where his imperialist heart had been deeply shocked by the sight of Boer, I'm not sure how to say that, families increasing, black families increasing, one of the tribes, while the British were obviously limiting theirs.
The Boers were Germans,
Oh,
immigrants.
okay. I
Northern-
thought since it's
Northern
South
Europe.
Africa, this was a black and white
No,
thing.
this was, Boers were.
German immigrants, yeah. Well, you can see a little bit of that today where some people think, well, these Mexicans pouring over the border and they're having more children than we are, and we're all going to be speaking Spanish here in a few years. And this really was a big, right about this time, it was a big topic of discussion, because Lambeth 1930 was the one that authorized birth control. But even then, it was very mild in the way it's worded. It just says that some methods may be permissible provided they are done, according to Christian principles or something like this. Kind of very vague. And also there's the oddity of the same conference called for the outlawing of prophylactics. So it's like, it doesn't quite fit together. But I have a theory on that. And I need to contact Janet Smith and ask her and see if she knows, because I can't find anything about the background of the discussions, the history of it or whatever. You just get the end result. And it says that there were like papers presented and stuff, but none of that's online. But 1930, what is the big thing in the scientific community?
Oh, eugenics.
Eugenics. So I think this whole thing, or at least what pushed it over, was, well, maybe we ought to think about when we procreate, weeding out some of these genetic defects and things like that. And it may be that, because they carefully avoided saying exactly what methods you're supposed to use or what's authorized or not. It just says it should be according to Christian principles or something. So I think the idea, or at least they convinced some people to vote for it, was, well, sure, you should convince, this couple over here that has a genetic problem that they would pass on, that they should, avoid the fertile periods and try to not have offspring and not pollute the gene pool and so on. So I think that's kind of the underlying issue that really got it over the hump. Now, once you got over that hump, it was just, give them an inch, take a mile. And so by the time it's addressed next time, in I think 1958, it's, whatever you want to do kind of thing. Except abortion. It does mention that, I think, explicitly. back then. But there were a lot of people in the church who were upset about it, and he says, bottom of 44, it was not only Anglo-Catholics who felt strongly about birth control at this time, for the Bishop of London wrote that he would like to make a bonfire of all contraceptives and dance around it. So it's kind of an interesting cultural window that you see that this obviously is a big issue, because this guy's handing out pamphlets to, an 8-year-old.
So do you think that the clergy resistance might have had something to do with their disgust at the idea of eugenics, or was it simply...
No, it's just a universal tradition before Lambeth 1930. I mean, there were no Protestant churches that okayed birth control of any kind whatsoever.
Okay.
And so it was just, this is going to be a slippery slope if there ever was one, kind of thing.
This was a reaction to the Lambeth.
Well, I mean, it didn't come out of the blue at Lambeth, so they were discussing it in the 20s, and then it came, to be voted on at the Lambeth Conference, which is every 10 years, basically. And we did a study on the Lambeth Conferences, and I think the 1921 might have mentioned it just very briefly, something like, at this time we don't recommend any changes on this issue, or something like that. He talks about, so he's making his confession in page 45. Once, in the big kiosk-like confessionals at St. Bart's, a deaf old lady came and knelt on top of me, and the priest had to come haul her off. And then here's a few things about confession here in the middle of the page. I remember a Cowley father barking, "That is a most serious sin," when I said I had not gone to Mass, having intended to do so the night before. I ventured to say, "It was not a Sunday, Father," and he bellowed, "Don't try to justify yourself to me, sir." I once said to a strange priest who was obviously not used to hearing confessions, "You haven't given me a penance, Father." And he replied, "Make yourself a living sacrifice." I left the confessional so puzzled that I went to another priest to ask what I should do, and he said, "Nonsense, just say 3 Hail Marys." Let's see here. Skip over some of this stuff in the middle here. Oh, that's a good one. Page 48, Father Doling. So he is the quintessential story of the persecuted priest. So he wrote a book called 10 Years in a Portsmouth Slum. And so Colin got a hold of this book, and he had an interest in being a priest before, but reading this book really solidified it for him. I want to be a priest. I want to be one of these heroes of the slums who's persecuted for righteousness' sake. So he says, I burned with indignation at the way Father Doling had been treated and longed to get into the fight. But the book also gave me a vision of what a wonderful thing it was to bring souls to Christ through the sacramental life of the church, and I wanted to have a part in the ministry which this Portsmouth slum priest had proved so efficacious. Considering how militant I felt toward bishops and what a dance I longed to lead them, kind of like a boxing dance, which I hoped might compel them to burn me at the stake. It is amusing that the temperature had changed to such an extent by the time I was ordained that, try as I might, I've never managed to have a cross word with one of them. And that was definitely true. It definitely changed a whole lot just in 10, 20 years over that course of time period.
Good thing.
He talks about in 1930, he went to Europe, to the, I'm never sure how to say this. Oberammergau, a passion play in 1930. And it was amazing and wonderful. And he also talks about the Cowley Fathers, and he encounters them and becomes, I don't know if he meets them at this point, maybe he's just heard about them, but he's fascinated by them, and so he at this point is like, well, I want to be a Cowley father then. I want to be a priest, and what kind of priest? I want to live in a monastery because I like the monastery that I met as a kid, and I want to be a Cowley father. They seem like they're the top notch. Yeah, because it's not until Oxford that he goes to visit the monastery, and he's disappointed. So he goes to Oxford, and he talks about that kind of college town attachment. And I experienced that myself with Waco. I just love Waco. Jerusalem on the Brazos. And I could have stayed there for the rest of my life. He says, Oxford was indeed to me a love affair. At one time I did not think we would ever part, and it is true to say that I still suffer from the separation. While the one thing life has taught me is that it is fatal to try and go back to one's tracks. And I've been to Oxford one time. I was visiting St. Stephen's house, looking at possibly going there to seminary. And it just didn't work out. But it was a fascinating place and just beautiful. And one thing that really struck me is that, now I was just in the center part of the city around the university, but it's like every direction you looked, it was old. Mm-hmm. Even the McDonald's was in like a 800-year-old building or something. The romance of this great collection of medieval buildings, many of them monastic in origin, made an immediate impact upon me. So he's just loving it. And a lot of the Catholic revival stuff is in the Oxford area because that's where the Tractarian movement got started. That's why they call it the Oxford movement. And so there's a lot of great churches to visit around there. There's a lot of monasteries and convents. And so he talks about going and having a heck of a time trying to find it, visit the Cowley Fathers. He ends up coming around the back way, and they begrudgingly let him in. And page 52, he says, frankly, the church was rather a disappointment. I'm not quite sure what I expected, but I think I had hoped to find it full of monks chanting in a dim religious light. Instead, I experienced what I have heard described as the Cowley chill. And in those days, the sacrament was not reserved in the open church, which shocked me very much. This is one of the things I was going to look up, and I ran out of time before now to see if there still is any Cowley presence in England. This is, by the way, the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And I'm not sure if they are still over there or not. There is in the United States. The biggest one is in Massachusetts, I think, around the Boston area. And then they might have one in New York as well. And maybe one in California, not quite sure. But I'm thinking they might have died out in England, that there are no more Cowley Fathers over there. And then he visits Nashtam Abbey, which is Benedictine. He says, what finally expunged Cowley from my thoughts was that soon after this I paid my first visit to Nashtam Abbey, and this provided everything that Cowley seemed to lack. So he talks about, page 53, the Anglican Benedictines had a stormy passage, for although they do not claim it in their own pedigree, their origins really go back to Elred Carlisle and Culdee Island. I suppose it was natural that I should have been fascinated by Carlisle from the first moment I heard about him, because he had done many of the things that I dreamed about. There can be little doubt that in many of the tangled reasons that he had in leading his community out of the Anglican Communion and over to Rome, one of them was the desire to find some other financial source to pay his considerable debts. The Roman authorities were horrified when they discovered their extent, but so much publicity had been given to the conversion of the Culdee monks that to reveal the true state of affairs would have involved a loss of face, which they were not prepared to suffer. And so this was a whole community that converted and was really centered around his personality. And I guess I sort of missed the connection of how this is connected to Nashtam. But it says, I guess it's just sort of the remnant that is the beginning of Nashtam. It says, the few monks that did not become Roman Catholics set themselves up at a house at Pershore in Worcestershire, and several of the monks I later knew at Nashtam began their monastic life in the sort of discomfort that only men can make if they live together. So I'm not sure if this is Nashtam or if some of those monks that were the remnant ended up at Nashtam later. In any case, there's a connection. And he talks about Father Delara Wilson, bottom of page 53, once told me that as a layman, he had gone to study there, and the door was opened by Abbot Dennis, who asked at once without any preliminaries, "Can you cook?" And when Laura hesitantly said that he could, added, "Good, then God has sent you." He found the kitchen in an indescribable mess, and at once went to the town to buy some new pots and pans, as those in use were burned beyond any power he had of cleansing them. And when he left some months later, the abbot said to him, "When the history of the Benedictine revival in the Church of England comes to be written, it should be recorded that you saved them from starvation." And then he describes Nashtam Abbey on page 54. Their most famous resident was Dom Gregory Dix, and it is very much as he describes it here. Nashtam Abbey was a great surprise to me, as it was not what I expected a monastery to look like, but it was a very grand house, designed by Lutines, I'm not sure how to say that name, for a Russian princess who wished to have a something in French near Windsor, a palace. Not quite a palace, but it's a big, grand house, kind of a plantation-like house. He says, once inside the front door, all my doubts at the secular appearance of the house were immediately dispersed. The porter was dressed in a black Benedictine habit, and at the entrance hall, from which a wide flight of steps led up to the chapel, was fragrant with the smell of incense, while a rather dramatic picture of the Sacred Heart hung at the head of the stairs. The chapel had been constructed out of the ballroom of the house, and visitors were allowed in a gallery, where once the servants had crept in to peep over the edge and watch the Russian nobility waltzing below. The high altar was an effective Baroque construction designed by an architect named Martin Travers, who used his considerable talents in transforming many Anglo-Catholic churches into passable imitations of Italian places of worship, except that he worked in papier-mâché, which cut the cost, but rather gave the impression of a stage set. The services were entirely in Latin, and this was the first time I had heard its use in the Church of England, but of course it reminded me of Cowfold Monastery and gave the place a feeling of authenticity. I was enchanted when one of the senior monks said, "That rogue Bishop Frere defiled our high altar by using English at it." Here, I felt, was the creme de la creme of Anglicanism. All is now changed, for the chapel has been remodeled, and the altar without candlesticks stands in the midst of the choir, while visitors have been promoted to the principal position before it, the monks sitting in tiers on either side like a choral society. The last vestiges of the Latin tongue remain in the anathemas of Our Lady, sung after compliment. I think he's just making a wisecrack about the anthems of Our Lady, the anathemas of Our Lady.
Well, they didn't spell it that way, but yeah, I don't know what that is. I have no idea what that is.
Oh, no, it's the anthemas. I saw the end of it and it said anathemas. Anthemas.
You've ever heard that word before?
It's not anthems? I don't know. It says, it used to be said that the only book of common prayer to be found at Nashtam was in the library, filed under comparative religion. But this was untrue, for after my cousin's death, who was there, I was sent a prayer book, which had belonged to him, and which showed signs of great use. Not that he was in the least sympathy with the changes in the church, and on my last visit before his death, he said, "Vespers still remains a fairly Christian service, except that we have a whole chapter of the Bible read to us in the middle." And then he talks about Dom Gregory Dix, and Dix was kind of a snarky guy, brilliant, but had a sense of humor. And he had teased the bishop because the bishop said, "You know, I just want the regular old prayer book confirmation service when I come around." And so he told a story about another bishop who was asking for that and was denied all of the extras that he expected. And he was visiting a boys' home for the mentally challenged. And so the bishop has to basically come to the realization that, oh, the plain old prayer book service doesn't really have much in it. And so he says, the bishop thought for a moment and then said, well, I suppose as they are all mental defectives, it doesn't really matter. And so he was able to, by this, acid, well, not acid tongue, but this trail of logic, get him to admit that he really wasn't in favor of it from the start. He talks about his college at the university is St. Edmund Hall, and it's one of the older ones, unkindly known as the Queen's Backside, as it was in Queen's Lane behind Queen's College, is lovingly referred to as Teddy Hall, St. Edmund Hall. And he said there was a chapel, there was a daily mass, pretty well attended. One time he got in trouble because he was serving and he forgot that he was still wearing his bedroom slippers, which were red, like the Pope's red slippers. So he got chewed out about that. He lovingly called Oxford a city of dreaming spires, which I thought was neat. It reminded me of Milwaukee, because when you are going toward downtown, it's on the water, and there's a interstate coming up from the south, and there's one going out to the west, and there's this kind of just big arched bridge going from one to the other. And as you look out across the city, it's just rows and rows of church spires everywhere. And it's just lovely. I thought, oh, if all churches still looked like that and had tall, peaking spires. Steeples. I always loved steeples. Because the steeple at the church I grew up in was enormous.
Really?
Yes. I can show you a picture later. And then he talks about some of the sort of not to be missed churches. And so he was wanting to get more familiar with various different places, so he visited some of these monasteries. His friend, Charles Smith, kind of filled him in on some of the subtleties of Anglo-Catholicism, and he said, I discovered there were only 5 churches in the British Isles in which one could completely rely on finding the faith without too much soda water squirted in. They were St. Peter's Folkestone, St. Saviour's Hoxton, St. Michael's Edinburgh, St. Paul's Oxford, and Holy Trinity Reading. Of these, only the first and the last still remain open to keep the light on, keep the light shining. And I've heard of St. Saviour's Hoxton before, and I printed out a blog post I had done about it a while back. And so I was reading through Martin Travers, a book about Martin Travers, the guy who designed a lot of these altar pieces and stuff. And they have a little description of St. Saviour, because he did some work there. He said, St. Saviour was a thorn in the side of the usually tolerant Bishop of London, Winnington Ingram. Ironically, it was the bishop himself who had intervened to procure the living for Father Ernest Kilburn in 1907, after it was proposed by the Crown, who held the right of presentation alternately with the bishop. So I guess they have to trade off who gets to nominate the priest. Kilburn was inducted as vicar in 1907. Initially, his views appear to have been quite moderate, and he followed the English use, in other words, the kind of serum, big flowing surplices and that sort of thing. However, by 1910, incense was being used, and by 1911, the magazines referred to Mass instead of Holy Communion. By the end of the First World War, he had turned the church into a working replica of a Roman parish. Mass after 1919 or 20 was always said in Latin, and all the usual Roman devotions were observed. The Sunday evening service was normally Vespers and Benediction. Dom Anselm Hughes, in his personal history of the Catholic movement in the 20th century, a sympathetic observer wrote, quote, occasionally, an individual has made the mistake of moving too far ahead of the front line and so losing contact altogether. This is most certainly true of E. Kilburn. The problem facing the authorities was that Kilburn himself was a saintly figure, and the church was always full when others were not. And it says, after that, in 1927, Father D.A. Ross became vicar, and he had to promise before his institution to revert to the vernacular for his services, although the church continued to be papalist in tone. It housed the offices of the Confraternity for Unity from its establishment in England in 1929. And in 1932, Travers returned to tile the sanctuary. Unfortunately, in 1940, the church was severely damaged in an air raid, and being in an area which was rapidly being depopulated, it was not rebuilt. One of Travers's exotic but cheap schemes from this period was thus lost forever, and it is fortunate that there is some photographic evidence of what he had done there. It's kind of a small picture, but he would build very tall and frilly Baroque papier-mâché, basically, reredos, and have lots of hangings and frilly things to really give it some color and pizzazz. And going back to Merrily on High, on page 59, he talks about St. Paul's Folkestone. He says, to open the great doors under the classical portico was to be transported into a church in the middle of Paris, for it was French Catholicism, which Roger Wodehouse, the vicar, loved above all things. The great Baroque tabernacle, which revolved and turned itself into a throne for benediction, that is one that they got from a church in Belgium that was bombed out. It was said that a foreign Catholic was taken to St. Paul's, Blackfriars, and Pusey House. He was quite certain that St. Paul's was Roman Catholic. Blackfriars was Protestant and was not sure what Pusey House could be. So that kind of gives you the lay of the land there. Pusey House, strange. I guess it seems very Catholic-y, but there must be some oddities of the period which was not quite on the front lines, I guess, of ritualism. And then Blackfriars, probably just because it was a monastic establishment, or maybe it just used to be, not sure. But anyway, it was very bare bones and austere and monastic. So I figured, well, it must be a Puritan place. On page 59, he talks about this priest, Roger Wodehouse. He says, another thing he taught me was to be able to see the funny side of those to whom one ministers. And this has been an enormous help in avoiding the neurotic scenes and rows in which some clergy seem to get engulfed. And I would add also that you can't always take yourself too seriously. You need to be able to laugh at yourself. It also made me think about, I don't know if it goes beyond my own circle of friends, but we had been talking about and joking about it. It seems like every sort of Anglo-Catholic shrine parish had a what do you call it? A mascot. There was some weird person attached to the place. And I only know, but someone had described that Ascension and St. Agnes, or maybe it was a different place. There was a guy who had some mental problems, and he would dress up in white like the Pope and follow the procession out, and he would have a basket of rose petals and throw them around.
Church needs somebody like that.
And then when we were at Ascension in Chicago, there was this weird guy up in the front row, and he looked like Tiny Tim. He was kind of dressed in a purple velvet suit and long hair, and he would like bang on the front of the pew, the modesty panel in the front row. And like there was something that was going on that he wasn't satisfied with. He would show his disappointment that I don't know what was going on. I didn't want to get to know him. He said that Roadhouse ended up getting into some trouble, and he doesn't say what it was about. But he says that unlike some people, he responded very well. And he said he had the kind of character where, he says, one of the secrets of his charm was that he'd never grown up. and a person with more guile would not have behaved with the foolishness which led to the charge of indecency brought against him. So it made me think about, like, Bill Clinton, when he got in trouble. It's like those kind of strong personalities. It's the same thing that makes them great, also gets them into trouble. He said it was a great friendship, which has really nurtured him over the years. And he talks about the Bishop of Oxford at the time, Thomas Strong, was this bishop who was very tolerant. He's like, as long as I don't talk to you and you don't talk to me and you don't bother me, I won't bother you. It says, Thomas Strong, all he asked of the clergy was that they would not bother him, he would not bother them. Of some row in a church at Maidenhead, he said, the real tragedy of the whole thing is that the man wants to see me about it. Say, there's a problem, he doesn't want to get involved. And then starting on page 62, he talks about papalism. Father Orr, he says, was the first thoroughgoing papalist he had known in the Church of England. He said Father Orr, when another priest was preaching, was commonly raising his biretta at every mention of the name of the sovereign pontiff, because the other priest was complaining about the Pope in his sermon. And then he says, when he died, his wife gave me several of his things, including a hair shirt, saying, my husband always wore it before he married me. And I think maybe there's a joke there of, it was torture enough being married to me, so he didn't need the hair shirt anymore. He says, I did not yet know enough to be surprised that such a dedicated Pope's man should have a wife. Of course, there were a lot of older clergy who had only taken up their position after committing matrimony, a turn of phrase I often heard in Anglo-Catholic circles. He says Pusey House was known as the Puseum. The librarians there were all clergy, and their main interest was really in kind of a chaplaincy. Interesting, he says St. Barnabas in Oxford was a place in the 1920s where men and women were still separated by sex. It's at bottom of page 63. Men and women were still made to sit on opposite sides, and the vicar would hop out of the procession to rebuke a woman visitor who thought she might sit with her husband. That might have been the last place anywhere, as far as I know. On page 64, it made me think about St. Francis and St. Matthias, kind of close together. We're talking about Saints Philip and James, very Sarum, and St. Margaret's, close by, very Western, were the center of a great turmoil at one stage when the vicar of Phil and Jim was making it Western, and the vicar of St. Margaret's was busy taking off the 6 candles from the altar and substituting two candles while introducing Sarum practices. So the congregation opted for a sort of general post, and it really seemed as if it would be more sensible for the vicars to swap parishes and let the people remain in the pews.
Yeah.
He says, I often went to pray before the Blessed Sacrament and would find the Venerable Father Hack reading from the sermons of Dr. Pusey to an old woman who had started her church life as the pew opener. In bottom of 64 is little kind of tidbits and anecdotes. I fear that I never went inside a low church except to look at it, and I'm ashamed when I remember taking a notice reading "No service on this table" from a tea shop and leaving it on the altar of a Protestant church on Hinckley Road. And there's another quip along those lines. When you have the jingle bells, the altar bells, you ring them. Hello, high altar. Oh, I'm sorry, he's not here. He's risen. He's talked about Father Harold, was from Murfield, and Murfield was one of the other monasteries called the Community of the Resurrection. It is still there, and there's still, it also is I don't know if it was at the time, but it has since turned into basically a seminary run by the monks. says Father Harold was one of the great old-style Murfield missioners. And in the vacation, I guess the class break, the school break, he would take us as his helpers on his missions. I can see him now, standing on a kitchen table in the chancel of St. Cuthbert's, shouting, "Oh, my brothers and sisters," and then dropping his voice to a whisper, so the packed congregation held their breath for fear they would miss a word of what he was saying. It was very old-fashioned technique, but it had a miraculous effect, and several members of the Salvation Army Band were converted and joined the church. And then he talks about how it was kind of a sad thing because then the band had to break up because it didn't have all the members playing the instruments that it needed. And then he says, "But times were a-changin', and I went on other missions with Father Harold, where he whipped himself into a frenzy, which scarcely ruffled the waters, and very few came forward to renew their baptismal vows, which was regarded as an essential sign of the message of conversion being received." Let's see, talks about Father Davies and Father, not sure how to say this name, Hrada, H-R-A-U-D-A, Hrada. So Father Davies had pushed this new church home that he found, Annunciation, several notches up the ritualistic scale, and then he left, and so his replacement had to kind of back it off a little bit. And one of the people at Annunciation was Father Hrada, who was upset by going back in a more Protestant direction. He says the flames were really fanned by an astounding old priest called Father Hrada, who had been assisting Father Davies, and after the changes had taken place, would groan and cry out, "Jezebel, Jezebel," when the prayer for the church militant was read. And being subdeacon, he went and sat down on the sedilia at the place in the service where he thought the Gloria should have been sung, and said it to himself. This turned High Mass for a few Sundays into a farce, until Father Hrada no longer took part, and said a private Mass in Latin in a separate chapel under the tower. What he was doing in the Church of England at all was hard to tell, as he was an Austrian, and once said to us in a sermon, "AC, what does it mean? Amateur Catholic. RC, what does it mean? Real Catholic." And then on page 68, later on he's in a nursing home, and his priest friend Roger and he goes to visit him, and the matron of the nursing home asks, "Is he a Catholic?" To which Roger replied, "As a matter of fact, he's a Protestant minister, but for heaven's sake, don't tell him I said so." And then he wraps up the chapter by talking about Walsingham. So he goes on a pilgrimage, and this is one of the first walking pilgrimages, and this is right toward the beginning where they move the statue from the parish church to the shrine, and have obviously just built the shrine. And the bishop didn't like this whole pilgrimage stuff, and he demanded that the Walsingham statue, which had been recreated from a medallion, what the image looked like, and he said, you need to take that out of the church. And so he did, by building a shrine to move it into. And the shrine was not owned by the diocese, and so he could have sort of free reign there. So he took it out of the church and to satisfy the bishop. And so that is today, I think, what is it, October 16th or 23rd, something like that. The Feast of the Translation of the image of Walsingham. He says Father Kenrick was one of the 2 or 3 people, 3 priests and 2 laymen, that went on the pilgrimage on foot, walking from London up to Norfolk. And he was the one who wrote the English Missal, the first one translated. because I don't think his name is anywhere in the actual copy. He talks about a little bit of the history of the shrine, and Father Hope Patton, very kind of charismatic, but also seems to be introverted at some level. He says he was, where was it? I found Father Hope Patton enormously attractive. He looked as I thought a priest ought to look, for he was a handsome man with a great presence and dignity, but very reserved and rather remote, unless he was making an effort to exert his considerable charm. And then he says, I'm not given much to premonitions, but from the first moment I came to Walsingham, I was convinced that the shrine was to play a part in my life. It is interesting that Father Patton once told me that as a boy, oddly enough, also strongly influenced by the Brighton churches, he had a feeling that one day he would have a charge of a shrine of some kind, and that when he first arrived in Walsingham, he felt at once, this is it. So there's a connection between him and the founder. In fact, if we'll get there later, he succeeds the founder as the second administrator of the shrine. And he said something that resonated with me, bottom of page 71, and we'll finish up with this. Talking about, I was very interested in church in college, but I was a well-rounded individual. I did other things. I went to a lot of parties. I did rowing in college, and I was in the drama society. He says, in fact, there were moments when I thought I might well give up all idea of the priesthood. However, when I was at Nashtam and Walsingham, I knew that I would never be able to live comfortably with my conscience if I took any other course. And that resonated with me because I was thinking back to high school and, career days and stuff like that. And I did shadowing a career kind of thing with the pastor of where I was at, and talked to him about, is that what I'm called to? And he said, do anything else. And if you can do anything else and be content, go do that other thing. And that was what really kind of sealed the deal for me, because I thought, if I went and did something else, I would always have that gnawing, I did the wrong thing, made a mistake, kind of feeling. So that is chapter 3 and 4, and we will continue next time. Thank you.